The Forgotten Revolution in Puerto Rico. And next week, or in 2 weeks' time, we're going to celebrate our unofficial illegal holiday of our quote unquote first revolution for independence called the Cry of Laureus. Technically speaking, this is the fourth ever revolution. Now, I did videos before, but they all got deleted because, you know, because of American imperialism doesn't want you to tell the truth. Our first revolution was in 1511, 3 years after the Spanish made their first settlement, and the first revolution in Latin American history. But if we gotta be like most white people, we're going to ignore the indigenous struggle. Then our second revolution was also the the basically the second ever revolution, or the third, depending how you look at things, in the Caribbean. And remember, this happened in 1822. So what happened? In context, we have to look back what happened before the lead up to the second ever revolution for independence in 1822. It all started in the United States of America where they liberated themselves from England in 1776. And then in Haiti, we made it the first black republic. And between 1909 to 1918, many Latin American countries in Central and South America declared independence, although most of them only lasted a year and some of them only lasted a couple of years. And this is during the time when Simon Bolivar and other similar people were starting to thrive. And then you had Dominican Republic that separated themselves from Haiti in 1920, 1921, calling themselves the Spanish Republic of Haiti. And with all these things, plus the French Revolution making the biggest influence to Puerto Rico, especially to the anarchist, socialist, and communist movement. The difference between the Puerto Rican one compared to previous revolutions is the name of what they call themselves and the capital. In many cases, after the 1511 revolution, all the other revolutions that came from the 1830s, the 1860s, the 1890, and the 1950, the capital will stay in San Juan, and the name will be Puerto Rico or the Republic of Puerto Rico. In this case, the second ever revolution wanted to call themselves the Republic of Borinquen or the Boricua Republic, naming the indigenous name of the island instead of the Spanish name of it, Puerto Rico. But unlike the other ones, besides the name, it's the capital. Instead of San Juan, like most revolutions, instead wanted to focus in Mayagüez, another indigenous name of the eastern coast of America. This is the reason because for many, the revolution was led by Freemasons, which the Freemasons was first founded in Puerto Rico in 1811, also in Mayagüez. This is a great article written by an official historian of Mayagüez, Federico Cedo Alzamora, called Mayagüez, the capital of the Boricua Republic, written in 2010. For more than 3 centuries, the island of Puerto Rico was subject to numerous military attacks and invasions from France, England, and Holland, which had the sole purpose of looting, seizing a rich booty of wars, and taking possession of the valuable strategic enclave that represent the island and incorporate as a colony of exploitation to the domains of their respective countries. In the second decade of the 19th century, at the height of the independence struggle in the ferocity of the Spanish America, and when Puerto Rico coasts were continually harassed by incursions and by insurgent curtains. In 1528, 1538, 1576, 1673, and 1796, French forces attacked, looted, and burned many times to destroy San Germán Piñales, trying in 1673 to do the same in Arecibo. In 1585, Sir Richard Grenville and Sir Harcourt and Sir John de Leith, leading in the English expedition, arrived and built a fort by the river at Guanarilla Bay, which they abandoned. In 1595, Sir Francis Drake attacked San Juan with a flotilla of boats and sank one of the boats on shore in the bay on fire, then the attack across the Bay of Oñasco being rejected. In 1595, the young Sir George Clifford Earl of Cumberland attacked San Juan in front of 400 men and took the city, but the disease decimated his trade and he was forced to leave. In 1685, 1688, 1717, and 1752, they tried to occupy Vieques. In 1702, the English attacked Arecibo and were repulsed by the forces of Captain Antonio de los Reyes Correa. In 1797, the most prestigious of the English generals at the time, General Ruff Abercrombie, attacked San Juan, and the head of the squad under the command of Vice Admiral Henry Harvey, with 68 ships carried 6,000 troops, which were defeated. In 1598, the Dutch fleet managed to penetrate San Juan Bay, anchor away from Moro batteries. The Dutch withdrew with their champions. Cante van Seal was defeated in a single combat by the Spanish champion Cate M. a Mesquiza and Quijano. In 1625, the Dutch general Botwin Hendricks took, sacked, and burned San Juan, leaving it in ruins, but had to leave it as he could not take the Castillo de San Felipe de Morro. In 1703, the attack between Ponce and Guayanilla being repulsed by Don Domingo Pacheco de Matos and his militiamen. From coastal film and smuggling activities and raids, clandestine operations of local pirates like Roberto Cofresi, the most famous pirate in the history of Puerto Rico, and also one of the supporters of the independence movement for Puerto Rico, actually joined forces with Simón Bolívar to liberate Puerto Rico, although he died shortly after the first attempt, who sailed under the Spanish flag. The island Puerto Rico was threatened by another invasion project whose purpose was to invade Puerto Rico to make it independent of Spain, proclaim the Boricua Republic, and establish it in the capital Mayagüez. The name Boricua is synonymous with Puerto Rico, according to the geographer Francisco Pastrana, who in the 19th century changed the accent of Borinquen, passing the accent from E to I in the name of the natives to gave to Puerto Rico. To make it more clear to know the linguistic side. He also spelled apparently with Duquatri. Does not appear to have been a particular surname or anything like that. The characteristics of the invasion project. This project invasion of 1822 should be different and very different from all the previous ones. None of those many other invasions that preceded had the purpose of making Puerto Rico independent. Now have welcomed and proposed the indigenous name of Boricua as a name for the republic that has proclaimed. Now have been conceived and the mercantile enterprise now had intent to make Mayagüez the island's capital. This is something unheard of. And remember, this is the only time somebody tried to invade to liberate us instead of enslaving us, like the Spanish and English and the and the French and the Dutch and the Americans and what else? Maybe well, China never invaded us, but they too are trying to make factories to exploit us. So the invasion boss. This war enterprise was conceived and carefully planned, organized, and probably run as a clear profit commercial enterprise by General Henry Louis de Fayette Villanueva de Courtrai-Hostin. This was a cold and experienced general of Franco-German origin military, veteran of the wars of the Napoleon and liberation struggle of Bolivar. Courtrai-Hostin had also been a teacher, musician, and writer, and one of his works was actually cited by Karl Marx. He was a regular friend of some of the most prestigious personalities of his time, such as the Marquis of Lafayette, the writer and poet Wilhelm, and the playwright Schindler, thinker and humanist Goethe. Hostin was born in northern Germany almost by the time of the founding of Mayagüez between 1755 and 1760. His father, Pierre Villalon, a pastor Protestant, possibly a Huguenot family, that is, of French and belonging to the Reformed Church, lived near the Hanseatic city of Hamburg and to receive a good German education. He attended the Prussian University of Holland and in Wittenberg, which allowed him to know the literature of their country, particularly his poetry of that of France. He mastered the French language in addition to German, served as a teacher of music in Los Cayos de San Luis in the Port-au-Prince in Haiti in 1815-1860, and as a teacher of modern language in various colleges in Geneva and New York between 1824 and 1839. He was highly retentive and polyglot, and he spoke German, French, Spanish, English, Dutch, and Danish. In 1795, he was a professor in Hamburg. He was a Republican ideas and liberal learnings, and he became involved in the perennial politics of different times of his life. Using a fictitious name, Peter Feldman posed as a Spanish merchant, probably to cover up intelligence efforts in favor of the revolution in France. It seemed that he lived in Paris, where he came to detest leaders like Robespierre and Marat. His aversion to tyranny led him to join forces with the revolutionary liberals and follow the arms race in France, since he was determined, disciplined, and used to command. Recruited by Benjamin Franklin, who advised in Paris in late December 1776, many young French officers sailed to 13 English colonies of North America revolt to fight against England, enemy of France. Among them was Philippine Trosso de Courtrai and the young Marquis de Lafayette. The first died there, upon his return from the United States, Gilbert du Mortier Lafayette, Marquis de Lafayette was received with great honors, appointed President of the National Assembly of France and the head of the National Guard in 1789. But during the reign of terror that broke out after the first moments of the revolution, he was forced to flee from France. When he arrived in Prussia in 1791, the Allied government at war with France considers one of those responsible for the French Revolution, but he asked him to join the French monarchical forces while he prepared to fight against the French Republican Revolutionary government, although it was not in keeping with the direction the revolution they had taken. Lafayette refused, not having to attack his own country, fight his compatriots, and spill French blood. The attitude cost him freedom, because of it the Emperor of Austria had him imprisoned. The influential contest of the Gaudrian-Hostien. Between 1794 and 1797, the Gaudrian took part in various attempts by groups of friends influential and financially supported Lafayette to free him, for he was imprisoned in Austria, such as Olmütz in Moravia, in which today in the Czech Republic, and in the Prussian prison, such as Mecklenburg in the Lower Saxony. Lafayette was released from prison on August 25, 1797, among other things thanks to the intervention of George Washington, who wrote the Emperor of Austria Francis II, and thanks to the General Napoleon Bonaparte, who guaranteed his security. The Gaudrian-Hostien accompanied Lafayette and his family until Hamburg, where he had asked his father to come to greet him and meet the general. He spent a while resting in Holstein. The Gaudrian-Hostien traveled extensively in Germany, visiting Berlin and Weimar, where he stayed longer than anywhere else, and Baluchstadt, where he met Schlechter. His military career. In 1800, the Gaudrian-Hostien joined the private general staff of Napoleon, took part in the Napoleonic invasion of Spain as commander of the French headquarters of the Marshal of the Empire. Etienne MacDonald, Duke of Taranto in Barcelona, 1810 to 1811. It came to work in some occasions one of the emperor's own private secretaries. When the withdrawal of Napoleonic forces from Spain began in 1813, the Gaudrian was confined in Barcelona hospital and was taken captive to Cadiz. There he enlisted the help of Spanish officers of that of several Mexicans. Residence and resigned in February 1813, he moved to Philadelphia, where he offered his services to the armed forces of the United States, which were not accepted. Then we have to talk about the Duke of Toronto, Marshal of France. He became interested in supporting the Mexican insurgency in Viceroyalty of New Spain against the Spanish forces, but as early as 1814, it was in the Spanish Viceroyalty of New Granada where he married a young Creole lady named Maria de Carmen, who she had offspring who accompanied him until the last days in Albany, New York. by taking interest in the struggle of independence of the Hispanic people of America, entered the Liberation Army of Costa Firme in time for the occupation of Cumaya and Barcelona in 1814. Tucotray asked to be recognized as a presumed rank of general that he claimed to have attained in the Napoleonic armies. Bolivar's initial reluctance to agree to that claim, but by then designating him as a colonel, was an insufferable source of resentment, and resentments eventually culminate in definitive break between the two, becoming Tucotray one of the most staunch detractors of Simón Bolivar. On January 18, 1815, Manuel de Castillo y Rada, supported by Tucutray, entered with his troops in Cartagena de Indians in support of the local elites, deported his royalty leaders for 6 years to the United States, sent the Creole aristocracy. It bothered him as much as the people making decisions as to see what they were taking by Peninsulares. The government of Greater Colombia conferred on Tucotray the rank of brigade chief, or brigadier general, which was the rank maximum it could offer. On July 5, 1815, Tucotray served as a commander-in-chief of the castle of the San Fernando de Boca Chica on the island of Tierra Bomba at the one end of the Boca Chica Canal, and the entrance of the Cartagena de Indias, the most fortress of the Greater Colombia, to bring the last to leave said fortress when Cartagena, defended by General Antonio José de Sucre, was besieged on August 18, 1850 for 15,000 Royalist soldiers, veterans of the Napoleonic Wars in Spain under the command of General Pablo Morillo, being recovered by the royal armies. Boca Chica Castle in Cartagena de Indias. Tucotray hosting circumvented the site on December 5, 1850, and escaped from the Cartagena with Antonio José de Sucre, Manuel Cortés Compañeros, Carlos Suplete, and others like Luis Francisco de Rios. The next day, the Pablo Morillo occupied Cartagena de Indias with his royalty armies. After 108 days of siege, which half of the population perished. On December 8, 1850, Tucray embarked with his family to break English Constitution command by the French commander Louis Michel Aubry, heading to Los Cayos de San Luis, a small coastal town in the southern coast of Haiti, with the intention of meeting with Bolivar. But 3 days later, the Corsair Michel attacked them and stole their belongings with the nearly 400 refugees from Cartagena fleeing the Royalist armies of Morillo, and left them abandoned in the Caribbean isolated Neo Grenada island, Provincienda, in the small archipelago of San Andres y Providencias. Arriving as best he could to the San Luis Keys, to great hosting, having been stripped of all his property by the Corsair, he came to earn the life as a music teacher. Bolivar was in Jamaica seeking support for his cause, which was the Union or Confederation of the Hispanic People of America, hereafter known as the Castilian Kingdom of the Indies. He did not succeed apart from loan he made to the Englishman named Maxwell Hislop, which those process he published him letters from Jamaica, in which he expressed and made his ideas known, aware that Cartagena has fallen into the hands of the Royalists, and that a good number of its defenders had managed to flee to Haiti with the supplies, ammunition, and ships that Louis Brion had managed to save, headed there. He arrived at San Luis Keys from Jamaica on December 24, 1850, and on January 2, 1860, he met Port-au-Prince with General Alejandro Petillo, president of Haiti, who promised to provide him with the resources necessary to carry out his campaign, in which he had help of the Haitian military governor of Los Cayos de Saint Louis, General Ignacio Marion. President Petillo wanted Bolivar to emancipate the slaves and domains that made them independent from the Spaniards, since he considered the continuation of black slavery and the rest of the America as a threat to the survival of the Haitian black state, and believed in the independence of the Spanish America would increase the relative strength of Haiti by moving the principle on another European power and promote the recognition of the Republic of Haiti by other nations, which they had not yet achieved. Haitians, which is why they were still considered worldwide as a colony in rebellion. On February 7, 1816, an assembly of patriots from Costa Firme met exiles in Haiti in the homes of Mrs. Juan Bolville in the suburb of La Sabane for Los Cayos de San Luis. There, Bolivar was proclaimed by his companions as supreme chief of the Grenadians and Venezuelans, although there was serious disagreement on the scope that their powers would have because of his disciplined European-style military training. Ducoudray-Hostin felt discomfort at the lack of discipline and opposed to sloppiness and little customs Bolivar's men, someone who had been courtier from Pedro Luis Barrion. Despite this, perhaps precisely to smooth things over, Ducoudray-Hostin was appointed chief of the expedition staff and commander of the Bolivar headquarters. Bolivar's expedition to invade Venezuela and defeat the Royalist troops. It was made up of a small fleet made up of the brig of 6 schooners, in which there were 240 expedition members, mostly officers, and many of them high-ranking, including 6 generals and many families which number about 300 people. He left Los Cayos de San Luis in Haiti on March 31, 1816, following the southern course of Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, bound for the island of Margarita. President Petion paid for the freight of the schooners and supplied them with 6,000 rifles, ammunition, food, and a printing press and a large sum of money. Pedro Luis Brion, who had financially held the expedition, was promoted by Bolivar in Los Cayos de San Luis to capital of ship and organized the squad with which the expedition on the coast of Venezuela and the subsequent invasion of the country. On the expedition they went Ducoudray-Hostin, who had reservations about Bolivar, Santo Marino, who disrespected or did not recognize Bolivar's authority, Manuel Piar, who ended up being shot with, and Pedro Luis Barron, Carlos Suprial, Judge Mark Gregon, and Jose Antonio Anzoátegui, Justo Pricero Ortolarra, Francisco Antonio Sea, Pedro León de la Torre Arieche, Ambrosio Plaza, and others like Simón Bolivar, left General Amburgues out of the expedition, who flatly refused to acknowledge his authority. On April 16, 1816, the expedition passed within sight of the southern coast of Puerto Rico. In the power of its royalist enemies approaching the island of Vieques, this fact was considered enthusiastic insurgent as an anniversary of the independence celebration with the jubilant artillery salvos. The emotional explosion of euphemism, realization how close the enemy was, and the awareness that there was still land to be liberated should have been entirely attached in the extraordinary memory of Ducoudray-Hostin. The germ of the idea. Perhaps for having fought the liberating armies of Simon Bolivar, Ducoudray-Hostin saw the possibility of making Bolivar's dream of making Puerto Rico independence, or perhaps because he was a comrade in arms of General Griego MacGregor and wanted to undertake feats similar to his to own benefit and those who will finance your project. Bolivar would not take 4 months to return to Vieques, but he would do it without Ducoudray and abandon his project to invade Puerto Rico. Ducoudray would not return to Vieques, but he would try to make Puerto Rico independent. When passing from the island of Santa Cruz, the expedition member captured a schooner Spanish load with coca, food, and ammunition. On April 25, they arrived at the island, Dutch of Saba, and on May 2nd they fought the naval combat of Los Tres Frailes against 4 Spanish warships, capturing the brig El Intrépido. Gunships with 14 guns and schooner Rita, this naval victory fought for the General Bolivar schooner at which Bolivar and Brion came, and it earned Brion that Bolivar would appoint him Admiral of Venezuela and Greater Colombia. Next they touched Venezuelan soil on the island of Margarita. The expedition opened the door at Costa Firme. The insurgents assured a naval support for the insurgent corsair, gave forces weapons to the rebels in the interior, and prepared the definitive triumph of the Republic. Bolivar, who was a Mason, landed on the island of Margarita determined to achieve the recognition of your leadership. There he dealt with many who had earned his generalate with the merit of their military actions and those who only accepted Bolivar's supreme leadership as a necessary evil. On May 6, 1816, met an assembly of the main authorities of the islands of Margarita, and there Bolivar got them to sign the Villa del Norte Act, whereby recognized Bolivar as the supreme chief, confirmed the special power conferred in Los Cayos de San Luis. Tucotray was one of the signers of said act. Then the expedition member arrived at Carúpano, where Tucotray Hosting had returned to work as chief or commander of the Bolivar headquarters. There, Bolivar, in gratitude for the help provided by President Petion, issued the decree of June 2, 1860, providing for the freedom of slaves in Venezuela to take up arms in favor of the insurgents. His farewell to arms. Grego MacGregor, a Scottish married to Miss Josefa Lovera, then denounced Prion, who was Captain General of the Liberation Army, accusing him of being as a participant in a conspiracy against Bolivar, allegedly instigated by Tucotray Hosting. MacGregor was promoted by Bolivar to General of Division, received later also the Order of Liberators, but in less than a year he had already left the Liberation Army. Such intrigues in the appointment of Carlos Supliente as the second-in-chief of Bolivar's general staff and his subsequent appointment as governor of the Bolivar headquarters, a promotion attributed by Tucotray to the intimate relationship that Bolivar held with Isabel Supliente. His sister, molded by Batucuray, Helsting, felt neglected and ignored, so that on June 23, 1816, he practiced the profession of bookseller. The same day, Sopro received for appointment replacing Ducre Hosting as Bolivar's chief of staff. It is possible that he had not resigned. Ducre Hosting, who had been shot eventually just as General Manuel Piar was a year later, allegedly for disrespecting Bolivar's authority. After failing in his plan to attack Guamana, Bolivar landed in Ocumare on the coast on July 6, 1860. He had his army landed and continued with his plans. He was defeated on July 14 at the Battle of Los Aguacates on the voice as the loyalists were approaching. Panic broke out in Bolivar's forces on the beach from Acumare de la Costa. Realists were really that close, but the confusion made the expedition fail. Bolivar's soldiers fled, hurriedly embarked, set sail leaving arms left on the land and left the Liberator on the beach. This was rescued by a patriot officer surnamed Piteau, who took him aboard El Indio Libre, where Bolivar managed to impose his authorities and re-establish discipline. From there, Bolivar combined his arms. Officers of the expedition they refused to recognize Bolivar's supreme authority. These had to return to Haiti to request more help from President Petio and launched from there on December 8th. His second expedition from Los Cayos de San Luis, which set sail from Jacmen, and during which, on August 5, 1860, the schooner Indio Libre ran aground in Vieques, where the expedition stayed for 5 days. The Conspiracy of Curacao. After living 4 years in Los Cayos de San Luis in 1820, Tucotray Hosting moved to Curacao, where he worked on a book about Lafayette and Meyer so much, which was later published in 1824, where he began to socialize with the wealthy French foreigners living in western Puerto Rico who did business in Curacao, possibly from sales of slaves. The foreigners felt harmed and resent the annoying restriction imposed on trade and maritime transports by the Spanish authorities of Puerto Rico. Sound familiar? In recent as a counterpart of the Bolivar insurgent activities. Again, sound familiar? They visit Tucotray attracted by his military experience, with the attention getting your interest in leading a movement armed to invade Puerto Rico and turn the island into a republic. Yet they opposed that. Led to a large and influential group of wealthy foreigners resident in Puerto Rico who were interested in expelling Spaniards from the island that would support him, and by joining forces and collaborating anything necessary, counting on the simultaneous favorable circumstance of a rebellion general coordinated by them among the black slaves in Puerto Rico. Curiously, the political program of the Puerto Rico Republic, inspired by the European Republican ideals, did not include the emancipation of slaves. Among those visiting Tucotray Hosting in Curacao was Mate, a French merchant with good connection in Puerto Rico, said most of the cargo from Puerto Rico arrived in their hands. George Gourlier, a Jewish merchant formerly established in St. Thomas and who in 1819 returned to his native Curacao, and a sailor named Boyet, probably Juan Bautista Puye, smuggler of French origin, called of a young Puerto Rican pirate Roberto Cofresi, probably from Cabo Rojo, and on the beaches of who take his last name like name. Tucrates is socially related also with the American lawyer Bastien Irvine, editor of the New York Columbia, which would be second in command in the project expedition led by Tucrates, and who would later become an agent diplomat of the United States in Chile. This is immigrant from the United States to Jamaica, from where he went to Venezuela in 1818 to demand the return of some North American schooners, Tigre and Libertad, where he'd been captured when they carried arms and ammunition for the Royalist Army, lived in Jamaica until 1890, then going to St. Thomas in the Danish Virgin Islands, where he lived until 1821. In turn, Ibine was socially related to Curacao with Juan Marcao, possibly one of the Markovich brothers, sailors immigrants from Ragusa in Yugoslavia, who were then residents in Curacao. Then they moved to Puerto Rico. These people had aspiration of benefit from the future government of the Puerto Rico Republic as if a business were treated. So you can tell, despite they want to liberate independent Puerto Rico, their intention wasn't the purest at heart. But still, on March 1st, 1822, Tucuray moved from Curacao to San Tomas, where he already had been there before. On April 6, 1822, he took out a passport for Puerto Rico. And this is where it gets here on out confusing. On April 20, 1822, Francisco de Chelo from Curacao informed the mayor of Guadilla, Don Juan Martinez de Acevedo, on a conspiracy of Corsairs insurgents who were organized in Venezuela port of La Guaria, the which had three larger ships and four arrows. Each of those ships will carry 300 landing men, in addition to those who could bring las flecheras to take fort of Aguada and Ponce. In turn, on May 18, in 1822, Mayor Aguadilla reported everything to Colonel Don Jose Navarro, superior political chief and intended general and acting governor of the island. Financial support for the expedition. It is obvious that Tucotray hosting expedition to invade Puerto Rico has solid financial support. Because without money they cannot buy or rent brigs or crews or troops, rifles or cannons or edible for a considerable invasion force. This support could not come out of the general's pocket, said he lacked the means of fortune and survived in Los Cayos in San Luis in Haiti and in Wilstack, Curacao, solely on the basis of teaching music and selling books. Neither can think that Bolivar was interested in the economic advance who was in his enemy. What is admirable is that a European, almost newcomer without great contact with the New World, quickly finds so much economic support in Fajardo, Naguabo, Guayama, Mayagüez, Omigueros, etc. in Puerto Rico, as well as in Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and New York, and that with so much it was easy to find experienced soldiers, officers, etc., instantly ready to take on its invasive enterprise. Support for the subversion. Tucotray hosting invasive expedition project organized as a daring and promising mercantile enterprise had to come behind the scenes with a discreet but strong financial backing from many influential people inspired by the profit model rather than high principles. Said supporter obtained through a wealthy foreigners established in Puerto Rico and some sector highly influential in the United States. It must have been respectable, solid, organized, and coherent, said the obvious effort of Tucotray hosting that were not hindered there in any way and did not need any other financial support. Even though the expedition should have been an operation extremely expensive, as it included a good number of large, well-armed ships and well-armed soldiers, were friends, whose crews were mercenaries, whose owner knew perfectly well the risk of the ship ran by taking part in a true war adventure. It also turns out to be very revealing to Cotran hosting's safety, where he was finally arrested, where every day he was going to have a happy ending in court, More adequate still was a final order that came from Holland, providing even for the destruction of the court records. It is hard to believe that a newcomer foreigner without fortune, without credit, could ride overnight without some powerful support and an expensive invasion project, so the possible Masonic inspiration that perhaps was determining and instrumental in the ease and speed with which, despite so many uncertainties, the project managed to solidly found it. However, when the moment of failure has come, and as the failures usually had no father, the shadow of silence obscured the subject, and no one else elaborated much on the matter. No one identified the forces at play, no one claimed initiative, no one assumed responsibility, and no one continued with the project. There does not appear to have been a trace of followers. The back and financial support disappeared as by enchantment. Everything was as if said invasion had been forged in the clouds to emerge spontaneous out of nowhere. Everything was erased from historical memory, and as not even a simple engraving on the General Tucotray has survived to this day, who was even branded a filibuster, leaving his memory barely like that of a simple man on the fringes of history. The reality is that the influence of various Freemasons in Puerto Rico and the Antilles became more perceptible in the early 19th century, and that even when Masonic organizations pride themselves on not having a political character, that it is true that in America the action of many lodges did possibly because they did not see the independence of the people as an issue strictly political, but rather a question of dignity and rights and the fundamentals of man. For the reason they extended the cloak of reserve, silence, or secrecy, and the advantage of his extensive network of contact to those who conspire to overthrow the government of His Catholic Majesty. In fact, the United States used their Masonic lodges as a fake columns of their incessant attempts of imperialist expansion, and more specifically still, the Organization of Philadelphia Masons incite revolution from Freemasonry, so that the Antillean independence, or they were Masons, or they work in circles satellites of Freemasonry, they acted in defense of neo-colonial interests in America. As a result of all this, it was said that everything had done in Puerto Rico for the whole land had been done in silence and in the bosom of their lodges, because in them the idea of a revolution was embodied in them, and the spirit and the idea of the free homeland. Mayagüez was a cradle of Freemasonry in Puerto Rico, says the Mayagüez Lodge founded in Mayagüez under the influence of the Venezuelan Freemasonry and constituted between 1808 and 1850. The starting point of Freemasonry of the islands in 1811, barely 2 years after the foundation of the National Grand Lodges of Spain, and constituted Mayagüez the first logia of Spanish obedience. The Americas were not idle either. Already before 1821, the large restoration of Mayagüez depended on the Greater East Community of Boston in the United States, spreading the spread of the Masonic light. A time of so much and so busy Masonic laborism, the Fortress Lodge of the Spanish Obedience, established in San Juan, was dissolved as one of the authorities discovered its existence. Among the papers of the Count Atorrepando conserved a large encrypted memorial inciting him in 1823 to a dangerous political adventure. The Mayagüez Road continued throughout the century. On September 20, 1885, the second inauguration of the Soviet Grand Lodge of Puerto Rico was held in Mayagüez. The significant influence of French immigrants in Puerto Rico from 1789 and the momentous revolution invented French in blood, particularly noted on April 17, 1797. When the French constituted an armed body under the command of their commander, Don Agustin Pares, and took an active part in the defense of San Juan, together with the disciplined militias of different towns, including those of Mayagüez, which came to the defense of the capital fancying the attack of the British squad in command of the General Sir Ralph Abercrombie. As the port closer to the Costa Hispaniola, Mayagüez was the point of arrival at the large part of the French immigration from the Saint Domingo French, and it was those immigrants who permanently established in Puerto Rico. The first Masonic lodge was made up of subjects of that nationality. The foundation of the development of the Grand Orient French in Mayagüez over 2 decades, between 1821 and 1841, is relatively well documented. The connection of the French obedient masonry in Puerto Rico with the great with the Great European North American orientation, the cat allied the exterior support. The great distance, the delay, and make communication infrequent between the island and its metropolis contribute to promoting the automatic character of the constituent Masonic bodies, which may well have led the fact that the backing of this insular secret society to the invasion of Tucotray. In sum, it was far from being anonymous and uniform. Freemasonry developed in Puerto Rico with more vigor and intensity than any other part of the island. Contributed to its progress and development of its culture, it should be noted that the first Puerto Rican sovereign lodge, the Grand Soviet Lodge of Puerto Rico, initially had its capital in Mayagüez and operated in the city from the temple of the Defia Lodge. I actually visited there actually. I may or may not join there in the future. The first Masonic Lodge in Puerto Rico, founded in 1871 under the jurisdiction of the Orient Colon, the Great Colon Lodge in Havana, Cuba. To be Mayagüez Mason of French ancestry, the main support of the expedition, is likely that the protagonism of Mayagüez in the context of the strength that the Freemason in Puerto Rico was, among other reasons, the determining reason it took Cotran Hostin's decision to establish in that city of the capital of his project Boricua Republic. The Mayagüez capital of the project Boricua Republic. In addition, the Mayagüez being the cradle capital of Freemasonry in Puerto Rico, which was perhaps its best source of support and context, Gerald Tucotray hosting had many other reasons and motives to make Mayagüez the capital of Boricua Republic. Since the western area of Puerto Rico resided many of its wealthier promoters, he had considerable French population, already which was site where many of the French immigrants had settled to manage flee from the French Saint Domingue, and the hacienda de Mayagüez was the most large and was one of the best ports of the island. Mayagüez was the largest and fastest growing population nucleus in Puerto Rico, lacked fortification, and could hinder the invasion, and its port was the port of most active export throughout the island, to which, being so distant from San Juan, it would take longer for Spanish troops to arrive from the capital. The invasion prepares. During these negotiations, Tucotray and his family moved to San Tomas in the Spanish Virgin Islands. From there, Tucotray then traveled to Philadelphia in the United States, where he found a lot of support and hired several boats. On August 10, 1822, Don Juan Lemin, the Spanish vice consul in Philadelphia, reported that a French name, surnamed Wishkar, was recruiting 200 men for a filibustering action, which the secret agent in Puerto Rico was the mulatto Pedro Du Bois, a native of Guadalupe and resident in Taguao, a neighborhood of Naguabo. In Philadelphia, Tucotray and Irving, along with 40 other people, rented a brig, the Mary, for $20,000. To its owner, Thomas Watson, who knew the purpose of the expedition. The Mary was armed with two guns. Two they lasted a Dutch bridge, the Estron, and they required a large number of rifle, pistol, cartridges, gunpowder, and other ammunition of war, and shipments of flour left for the Antilles in August 1822. A ship from Baltimore and another from New York would join them in the high seas. Three neighborhoods from Fajardo appeared on September 13, 1822, before Don Francisco González de Linares, the first civil governor of Puerto Rico, to inform him they had discovered the insistence of the revolutionary movement to make the island independent. And that said movement had support abroad and had many followers on the island, among whom was a French resident in Fajardo named Don Pedro Du Bois, a certain Derza, a Dutch resident in Guayama, and Jose Vicente Romano, a native of San Tomas and resident in Puerto Rico since 1811. After June 26, 1821, the port of Mayagüez and insurgent squad led by certain Villanueva, who had the intention to seize the port battery and set fire to the town. The entire Puerto Rico remained of alert. The accusations of insurgents were rejected by the Mayagüez neighbor. In the military department of the west of Puerto Rico, which covered from Aguadilla to Guayanilla, the Army Spanish had 29 individuals assigned for the force of Mayagüez and Aguadilla, and it was obvious that such defense was completely inadequate. By 1822, in the neighboring Danish island of San Tomas, rumors of an invasion from Puerto Rico, an island where the fields of coast were being carefully monitored in order to avoid the formation and organization of expeditionary groups, that would launch an attack against her. Certain instructions given to the occasion, knowing that 700 French and German under the command of German General Ducotray Hosting had left Boston bound for San Thomas Island with 9 schooners to form an expedition against Puerto Rico. They sounded the alarm. Ducotray expedition landed on September 16, 1822 on the Swedish island of San Bartolome, and there he led the ships Salina and Andrew Jackson, which were part of the expedition, said Ducotray wanted to go to La Guaria in 2 of the other ships to look for Colombia reinforcements. It was not necessary to carry these. Meanwhile, Bolivar launched his first call for a congress which the representatives of the people met Castilians of the Indies to join forces and complete their liberating work. On board the brig Mary, in which he brought 125 men under his command, Ducotray hosted wrote a letter to Mr. Boye requesting them to get from Courier the necessary money for it, recruit 100 more men, indicated that once the ship returned from Mayagüez, he would send 300 delters to his wife for the age of the Republic, but a Courier or any other person, if capable of it. The Spanish authorities of Puerto Rico were well aware of what was happening because of the governor of Swedish islands, Saint Bartolome, Jonah Nortelin, informed them that 2 brigs and a schooner that were part of the expedition under Ducotray hosting consisted of 8 to 9 ships with 400 to 500 men, 6,000 rifles, large stockpiles of supplies to attack Puerto Rico, and had arrived from New York and Boston to the Swedish island of Saint Bartolome, which was a neutral port and base of operations accessible to all, bound for the Dutch island of Curacao, but they preferred to wait for the expedition to take shape and all the ships involved would meet in the Antilles, and then proceed to take measures necessary for their annihilation. It is clear that the whole lockup against Ducotray hosting. Another communication from New York informed the authorities in Puerto Rico that some local separatists had remit the sum of 24,000 persons to finance the expenses of said expedition. Also, all of this was later confirmed by reports from Don Angel Laboral, the commander of the Puerto Cabello station in Costa Firme, of the Count Aliquin, Spanish agent in San Tomas, of Don Juan Limin, Spanish vice consul in Philadelphia, and of the Secretary of State in Madrid. In the middle of his journey between the island of San Bartolome and the port of La Guaira, in the coast of firm Ducotray, and he faced stormy weather and sea very stormy that caused damage to 2 ships and forced them to change their plans. The owners of these boats decided to interrupt their trajectory and enter the port of Curacao, where they arrived on September 21, 1822. The brig Entrate was in command of Captain Gold, and the brig Mary was in command of Captain Arroyo Burns, commissioned by Ducotray as Captain of the Marina Boricua. Descotrey and Rivi arrived in Curacao in the company of the mayor, 5 colonels, 100 officers, and many other Frenchmen who made up the Catholic direction of his project expedition to Puerto Rico, and with a good number of young men of the United States who, as mercenaries, they would be part of the same expedition. For the most part, there were respectable citizens. Among them was a certain P. Helger, probably from the name Heckler family, hailing from the island of St. Eustatius, who was very prominent in Santa Cruz and was well established in the Hormigueros and norte coast from Mayagüez. The Dutch authority of Curacao, pressured by the Spanish authority of Puerto Rico, decided to intervene. The brig Extra was supported by false Dutch paper, so that Governor Paul Caslar, Secretary William Prince, Judge Secrun, and Daniel Soriot, presiding judge of the Court of Justice of Curacao, and fiscal advisor Mr. Isaac James Remelman, a Xavier, proceeded to confiscate it. The brig Mary, in different circumstances since her papers were in order, but which was equally landed with men and arms, it was intervened also and placed under surveillance by the Dutch authorities. Ducotray, who had disembarked and was staying as guest precisely in the house, persecutor Esler Vor was arrested, and there on September 23, 1822, and the authorities seized the available cargo of arms and brought the proclaiming and other documents that revealed the true nature of his companion and the plan to disembark in Añasco. where he had been joined by the name gathered by Pedro Du Bois in Puerto Rico, and by then taking Mayagüez Military, which was the place destined to initially establish in the headquarters and the council state and capital city of Boricua Republic. As available cargo was lured from the ship of Tucray expedition, the Dutch authorities of Curacao found 6,000 rifles, 500 cabinets, 150 pairs of pistols, 12 field guns, 6 field carriage, 200 mounts, 15 barrels of cartridges, 60 barrels of gunpowder, and 2 drawers and one containing incriminating proclamations prepared in advance to be used as the objective of the invasion being achieved and printed with the purpose of the expedition, and other full of four-color codex for the expedition clothing. It is probable that the other ships that formed part of the expedition and who never reached Curacao were captured by the Spanish general and field marshal Don Francisco Tomas Morales. The Danish governor of St. Thomas, Peter called Frederick von Schulten, on October 8, 1822, the governor and canton of Puerto Rico, Don Miguel of the Tower, who had only been an officer for a month, offering information about the Mutalotes Pierrebiten and Luis O. Franquio Pinau, and telling him that the planned expedition had been arranged by a French called Donet, who had once been governor of Guadalupe, and he was now a well-known agent of the then Haitian president Jean-Pierre Boyer. Pedro Du Bois was detained by the Puerto Rican authorities, which gave him they occupied important documents. He was tried for the crime of conspiracy, with the foreigners found guilty and shot on October 12, 1822, in the presence of slaves from various mills involved in the plot in Guayama and the outskirts of Añasco, a place chosen by Tucotray Hosting because of its lack of artillery fortification and its convenient proximity to Mayagüez to effect landing of its troops. The judgment. Tucotray Hosting and Basti Irva Tucotray Hosting and Papisti Irvin were tried in Coraco for more than 10 months as mercenaries and disturbers of the peace for navigating using fake Dutch peppers. Tucotray claimed that he had always kept well aware of the nature of his expedition of the governor of Curacao and that his damaged ship had sought to forge emergency shelter in the port neutral in Curacao, and that he had the right to be received on an equal basic condition to any other distinguished traveler in a foreign country. Says no one had done nothing that were depriving him of his liberty or his right to receive the hospitality of the place. He indicated that if Curaco was neutral, there was no cause for Morisawa to arrest him or confiscate anything. Since the expedition was not directed against Holland, he pointed out that his accusers were a gang of thugs and bandits, and that all the interest of the governor and his henchmen was get rich unjustly by keeping their ships, the money, the cargo, and the war supplies and other spoils from Tucray host the expedition, which had cost more than 150,000 Richkas dollars, not counting the value of the ship, and in order to be clear, determine the prestige of the Netherlands. This result in most harmful gossip was the cause of public scandal. The civil commodore of Puerto Rico, Gonzalez de Linares, instantly demanded the shipment of Puerto Rico of the Cotray hosting and of the prisoners, but the Dutch authorities in Curacao refused. Eventually, the Cotray hosting and Basti Irvine were found guilty, sentenced to death, and their property looted by the authorities. Dutch allegedly because of their alleged criminal actions. The Cotray hosting expressed that he did not fear for his life, and his executioner was not going to dare to kill him when everyone knew there was no evidence to justify such a thing. In fact, Leon's sister, who was convicted of the roles of the brick and trash, had been allowed to abandon Curacao without receiving punishment or suffering any penalty. When Tucatra hosting and Ilvi appealed to the Supreme Court of Greverke in the Netherlands, the appeal was denied, so they requested reconsideration of said opinion, and this appeal was also denied. But the public discomfort and the public outcry grew in such a way, it came to have such magnitude that the governor himself, informed by his spies, instructed the prestige of the court granted the appeal. When all seemed lost to them, they were granted a third appeal, that the King of the Netherlands, Holland William I, received the advice of his Council of State and pardoned them, probably due to the influence of Lafayette and the United States government, which immediately allowed Tucotravos to immigrate to that country. The Minister of the Colonies of the Netherlands ordered the governor of Curacao to suspend all judicial proceedings. which would be annulled and their files destroyed, and that the accused were treated according to their regular education, released and paid their expense until they reached a place for their choosing. Upon being deported, Tucatral hosted embarked for the United States, while Irvini, who was an American, chose to move to Caracas, where he stayed until 1824, when he moved to Puerto Cabello, the stronghold, the most important place in Venezuela. James Monroe, the President of the United States, and John Quincy Adams, Secretary of State of the United States, it will be no more than another of so many examples of perfidy in American international intrigues, deny any involvement in this matter, even though no one could deny the participation of three prominent U.S. citizens, including the Sergeant Major Andrews, a former Army officer, and Major Agnew, an influential ownership power, who there is little doubt that he was who contributed much of the funds for the expedition, and Basti Irvini, who was none other than the second in command of the Tucotray expedition. Thus ended the interesting attempt to free Puerto Rico, which was led by a professional military veteran of the Neapolitan Wars and those of the independence for the Colombia and Venezuela, and by an agent of the United States, a well-planned, well-armed, well-equipped, well-backed attempt financially to have a real chance of success. The calm after the storm. On April 5, 1824, Tucotray arrived in New York with Maria de Carmen, his wife, and their children, determined to settle in that country. Their thought, of course, in military tactics and alter his own name. Instead, you see prefer of his name and his first name, the surname Lafayette, perhaps to conform it to the American custom or to honor young friend who owned his life and freedom for that same year. At the request of the Congress, the Marquis de Lafayette was invited by the President James Monroe to visit the United States, which he did on July 12, 1824, and must seem to cry for Lafayette was the baptismal godfather of the eldest son to Cottray, who was named Lafayette in honor of his godfather, just like Lafayette had given his son, who was accompanying him on his journey, the name of George Washington. Meanwhile, Bolivar did not give up his effort. Being in Lima on the 7th of December 1824, summoned the governments of Spanish America to attend an Amphictyonic Congress, in the style of those of ancient Greeks on the Istmo of Corinto, to be held in Panama. This took place on June 22, 1826, despite the effort of the United States, which attempted to prevent the assistance of Argentina, and that the Congress itself came to a successful conclusion. The then President of the United States, John Quincy Adams, introduced his delegates to prevent the launch of any other liberating expedition, such as that to Croix hosting to the last Spanish possession, Cuba and Puerto Rico, to which the nation obviously craved for itself, which could hope quietly, so they fell into the lap like ripe fruit fading along with the tree. This was the culmination of Bolivar's dream, the beginning of his failure, and the reason for everything that happened later in the Spanish Antilles before and after 1898. Ducotray's family, with their three children, settled in small town Seneca in and around Albany and near Geneva in New York State, and since the general, having failed to make Bolivar's dream come true, retired to live a quiet life of a college professor teaching at Geneva College, today Hobart and Smith in New York. There he wrote in 1829 his biography of Bolivar, and whom he became a staunch detractor. In 1835, he was professor of modern language at Albany Female College and wrote a text in French based on the theory that language should be taught without recourse to the use of improper translation. Tucotray Esteem died on Albany in 1839, and his mortal remains rest on the rural cemetery of Sault City. His family continued to live there for 25 years until the death of his son, Lafayette de Austin, had reduced the name of Tucra to a mere middle initial to surname simply Hosting. Meanwhile, in Mayagüez, nobody slept. In vain so many eyes hidden behind thick thickets of the Algarrobo and Playa Grande Litora surveyed, hopefully to dark horizons spent the long hours. Yearning glimpses in the contention of many nights to sail the ship of the invading squad. No one could know yet, but the long-awaited invasion in 1822 by Western Puerto Rico had been thwarted by the Dutch authorities at Curacao, perhaps in collusion with the United States government, and never came to materialize. The general who had planned and directed it had been arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. Although King of Holland ended up pardoning him, the Puerto Rico Republic could not be proclaimed, and Mayagüez never arrived to be its capital city. Better times will come indeed. Mayagüez is now preparing to receive another kind of ovation, that of the goodwill ambassador and many country brothers, who will soon fight cleanly and brilliantly in the field of sports before thousands of enthusiasts, athletes, and fans, locals, and visitors in the multiple events that, for the few glorious days, will make Mayagüez the headquarters and capital of sports throughout Central America and Caribbean. It certainly was worth the wait. And that is the strange story of the invasion to liberate Puerto Rico.